Mm-hmm.
You can never
Okay,
tell who's talking.
you should be able to hear me. Okay, now I'm muting everybody. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
everybody is muted. Okay, you should be able to hear me without any background noises. And a little bit about today and a little bit housekeeping in general. So today we're going to hear my father speaking about his parents, my grandfather and grandmother. We also have other guests I see, as my sister is here and some cousins as well. So yeah, very, I let everybody know that my father is speaking. So we have a little bit of family here, not just friends. Um, that's that. Oh, my aunt is here, but she's a little bit shy, so she might not be speaking. Um, and that's a little bit about who's with us today. A little bit of housekeeping in regards to the continuation of the week. So tomorrow we have with us Professor Tov continuing his discussion concerning the Masoretic text. On Thursday we have Dr. Yagil Henkin speaking about a war of independence and how come Israel won its war of independence against all odds. Next week, I'm working on next week's schedule, and I feel like in sports when you're able to get, to sign a deal with a very good player. So I actually managed to speak with two good players for next week. One of them is really very interesting figure. He is a farmer. He is an agronomist, a Bible teacher, and has a very interesting personal story. And the other one is maybe the most interesting figure to talk with about the judiciary in Israel. Little people know, but the judiciary in Israel, of the three branches of government, is extremely powerful due to changes over the last few decades in the Israeli system. And so we'll have the former advisor of the Minister of Justice, um, and he was behind some of the very interesting attempts to kind of bring the balance back between the different branches of government in Israel. And you're more than welcome to read all about the different branches of government in Israel. It's such an important subject, which surprisingly even people taking serious interest in Israel don't know about so much. So we'll have him, Gil Bringer. He was chief legal advisor for the Minister of Justice not too long ago. So we'll have him speaking. But as I said, today we have my father. A little bit about my father, since he probably would not sing his praises. So I'll take the opportunity. He is a former lieutenant colonel of the Israeli military intelligence. So intelligence is in the family. He is an engineer, electricity communication engineer, one of the pioneers of satellite communications in Israel. Uh, Above all, a father of 10 problematic kids. At least one of them is problematic. I don't know about the others. He will tell you, what he thinks about it, which makes my 6 look easy. So that's that. And whatever else you want to say about yourself, Abba, you're invited. I'm just putting the slideshow on screen, and these are his grandparents, and you'll take it from here. Abba, I'm unmuting your microphone. Just a second, so you can speak, and I'll make you. Yeah, go ahead, Abba.
Okay, good evening to everybody. Though at your place it might be good afternoon. By us, it's already evening. The pictures you see here is my grandfather and my grandmother from my father's side. They lived in a small village in, today it's Western Ukraine at the time that my father was born, 1915. It was under the Austro-Hungarian
The Habsburg Empire.
Empire, and then it became Czechoslovakia, the eastern part of Slovakia in Czechoslovakia. And during World War II, it was given back to Hungary. I say back because the Habsburg was Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Hungarians were ruling at that in this vicinity. And Neti is showing us a map. Slovakia, you have to go east, which is
what do you want me to show? I'll show just.
the area of Neresnice.
Okay, so it's that's the area here. It's in modern day Ukraine. You can see, guys.
Western Ukraine. Currently Western Ukraine, north of Romania and Hungary. Hungary is more to the west.
You can see Romania here and Hungary here, and this is the village where he was born.
Right. So those were his parents. They were they also perished during the Holocaust. We are not sure where it happened. Some people say it's in Sobibor, some people say it's Majdanek, but the fact is that they perished. Can we go to the next picture?
Yeah.
Well, as a matter of fact, they were born in that village in western, currently Western Ukraine. But when my father was about 4 years old, they moved to Slovakia, northern part of Slovakia, where my grandfather was a forester for a company that was producing, wood for various applications. And so my father grew in the northern part of Slovakia in a small village called Vyšná Pisana.
You can see it on screen.
You can see it on the screen, right. Not far from the Polish border, which is north of this location in Slovakia, right. Okay, so, and it was a few hundred kilometers west of his birth location. So he went to school in Jewish schools. His father sent him to learn far from home. And the system at that time was that you were eating by various gentlemen, as generous as they were. Some were really generous, some were not. And that's where you were eating. They didn't have a dormitory or things like that. This is a picture that has various members of the family, mostly sisters, and I'm not sure he is there, but mostly sisters.
Yeah.
You can see.
It should be said in this context that they are baking matzot for Passover. So it's around the same time of the year. It's just before Passover. You can see they're holding the round matzot right in their hands, the unleavened bread.
Well, I know this picture for many years, but I didn't remember that it was about Pesach time. Okay.
It says down under. Beit Afiyat Matot.
Pesach. Yeah, right. Okay. Sorry. Okay, go ahead to the next one. Okay, this is a picture of my late father. Several pictures of him, and on the top you can see, on the left top side, you can see also two sisters that survived the Holocaust, and one of them went to the United States right after the war, about 46, and the other one went to Israel, and she and her husband went to the United States in about 56 or something like, no, not 58. And they lived in Cleveland. And this sister that lived in Israel and went to Cleveland, she's still alive, and she lives now in New York with one of her daughters. The documents that you see on your right-hand side, I think is some professional certificate announcing him as a baker, which he got in, I think, 1936, if I'm
By
not
the way,
mistaken.
anyone reads here Czech or Slovak? Maybe we have someone reading it. Never mind. Some of my
It's a membership. It's a membership. Tovarishki list. It's a membership in some union or of bakers. Given to him in 1936 when he was 21 years old.
Right. Abba, I think it's very interesting to know about Saba, about your father, that he went, his parents didn't want him to go and learn profession so much. They wanted him to sit and learn Torah, like to be a rabbi or anything. And he understood that that's not his, not what he's going to do. And he decided to leave home at the age of about 16 and leave and start, going to fend for himself and to find a profession. And he, can you tell the story about him deciding to do that and ending up as a baker indeed?
Well, the fact of the matter was that he hasn't been home since a very young age. But in his teenage, I think, he decided that he doesn't want to go on learning, and he wants to have a profession that he can make a living. And somehow he started working in a bakery, and he became a baker.
Yes, yes. What led him there was he was so hungry because he took some money, his mother gave him a little bit of money, and he walked and walked every day, and he was so hungry at the end of the day that he could not continue. So the smell of the bakery, like in the cartoons, drove him into a bakery, right? He was so hungry. That's what led him to baking. And he said, "Can I work here?" And they said, "You know what? Let's try." And they he worked for 2 years so they kept him there, and he didn't get paid or anything. Just he got fed for 2 years, and he ended up being a baker because he was so hungry. He was drawn to the bakery.
Okay. Okay. At the age of 1, I think, my father joined the Czech army, and we have here pictures of him. On the left picture, he is at the bottom left, and on the right-hand picture, with more people from his squadron, we can see him the top line marked by this red mark.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Now, when we make a jump according to the pictures in the years, he served in the Czech army as a baker, and when the Germans took over Czechoslovakia, so he fled from the Czech territory, which was divided into Slovakia, which was given independence under some collaborator with the Germans. Tiso, a Reverend Tiso, Catholic Reverend, I think he was, and the Czech parts, Bohemia and Moravia, were annexed to Germany. So he fled to the area where he was born, which was then given to the Hungarian government, because it used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there he married, let's go back to the pictures, because, so he got married to a cousin that a daughter of one of his uncles in a place called Bardio, if I remember correctly. And he had 2 children, and he had a bakery at that place. And so we have pictures here from his wedding and with his wife, and the wife with one of the children, and another picture of one of the children.
It should be said, though, that this is not your mother; it's his first wife.
No, not my mother. Yeah. Cousin, his first wife. Yeah.
And they ended up in Auschwitz.
Yeah, they ended up in Auschwitz. The situation. What happened is that my father was taken in, I think, in 42 to the Hungarian. They took the Jews into companies
labor,
that, right. Companies in the Hungarian army that were given very dangerous jobs, like clearing up minefields and alike, so that they took a lot of risk. And he was with that in that force, and they went into Russia with when the Germans invaded Russia, and with the Hungarians. And later on, when the Russians got over the Germans, so they retreated all the way back to. They retreated, and he was captured by the Russian army.
So for those of you who are not following, just a second. He already served in the Czech military, right? The Czech really were sacrificed by politics of Europe to the Nazis. So the Nazi occupation, he actually had a very interesting episode.
The Munich
the Munich Agreement of
the Munich Convention.
Right.
Yeah.
The appeasement of
1928.
Nazi Germany, and then he served a little bit after the Nazi occupation of that region. He served as a waiter to the officers of the Nazis. Little did they know that he was Jewish. He spoke some German, so they used him as a waiter in the kitchen. Even though he was a cook, he was a chef. Anyway, he ended up being a forced labor for the Hungarian military, and he fell into the Russian captivity in the Eastern Front. So Czech army, Hungarian army now becomes the part of the Russian army. Right.
Well, about the Russian army, let's put it that way. He was sent to Siberia as a POW. And then when the Russians established the Czech army of General Svoboda, later to be the president of Czechoslovakia, he told them, guys, I was a soldier in the Czech army. I want to join the new Czech brigades that General Svoboda established. And then he joined the second brigade of the Czech army in Russia, and the second brigade was a paratroopers brigade. And I don't know if let's go over to next picture. That's something.
No, the paratrooper part of it, yeah. So you can see.
That's a book that on the left-hand side that my late father wrote. And he didn't write it, but he was telling the stories to a guy, and the guy wrote it down. And it's very interesting, you know, when you are finished with studying Hebrew from the Tanel, you will enjoy it very much.
I hope one day to be able to translate it into English. Among many other projects, I'm not getting anywhere with it at the moment. So yeah, but I hope one day to sit and translate it into English. It makes for a very, at least for us, it makes for an excellent read, because as we read it, we can actually be reminded of how he used to tell these stories, because this autobiographical book is written in a very kind of like almost an oral way, as he's telling a story and not really writing a book. So for us, it's a special experience even reading the book. So yeah, he volunteered to the Czech brigade. Go ahead.
Go back, please, to the books for a minute, if you don't mind.
No, I don't.
The name of the book, Bin Ushnot Dor, Neti.
Right, understand the years of former generations. So that's a quote, obviously, from Deuteronomy 32. Yeah.
Okay. So, and the purpose of the book was to tell everybody the history of the Jewish people from his point of view and his personal experience. On the right-hand side, we see the picture of our eldest son, our late son, Yair, who got killed in Lebanon.
He was killed in action. Yeah.
1995, when his armored vehicle went up on a explosive charge. He and another 5 of his mates got killed on that day. And actually, on the same day, on that day, which is we call it Hoshana Rabbah, which is the eve of the 8th day or holiday of the 8th day in Sukkot. Neti, would you like to?
Yeah. It's the last day of the Festival of Booths, essentially. Okay.
Okay. And there is the pasuk, the verse. The verse.
Yep.
Okay. למען איתן הנזרק בלהב אש, for
Yeah,
okay.
it's a verse from a post-biblical poem that relates to a homiletic story about Abram, who was refusing to worship foreign gods even when thrown into the fire, also inspired by the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. So there is a post-biblical rabbinic homiletic story telling a similar story about Abram, and this poem, or this verse in that poem, refers to the story about Abram not willing to worship foreign gods, even when thrown into a burning fiery furnace. So my parents took this verse from that poem, and that is the title of the book that was written commemorating the memory of Yair, my brother who was killed in action in 1995. I hope it wasn't too much of a complicated explanation, but that's how it is with poetry. It always alludes to all kinds of complicated stuff. So going back to the war, do you want to say a few words about how Saba fought the Nazis?
Okay, so yeah, so actually in 1944, I think, there was, as I said, in Slovakia, the government is collaborating with the Nazis. Reverend Tiso, he was the president of Slovakia, and at that time already the Russian armies, or all the armies working with the Russians, pushed out the German and Hungarian armies, and there was a mutiny in Slovakia against the Nazi collaborating government. So at that time, the Russians sent in the paratrooper brigades in order to support the mutiny. So at the beginning it went okay, but then they had to go into the woods to become like partisans, because the Germans, the Slovaks called in the German army, and that was a bit more difficult to deal with. So they spent several months in the woods, trying to fight and avoid the greater forces that were sent to fight them. These are medals and decorations that were given to my late father in Israel on their part in the establishment and Tkuma, revival.
Yeah.
A revival of the state of Israel from all the trouble we had during the World War II, and then in the the wars since 1948.
Right. On the left-hand side, also on the left-hand side, you can see the decoration that the state of Israel gave anyone who fought against the Nazis. So anyone who fought against the Nazis received this decoration on the left-hand side. And my grandfather was very proud. Every Independence Day, every Veteran Day, or whatever, he would have these medals on his chest. We don't have the picture here, but there is, he used to, be very proud of these decorations.
I think that the bottom one is the Milchemet Sinai.
Yes, in 1956, the Suez Canal operation. Yeah, in 1956, my grandfather was part of the veteran corps of the IDF. Ah, Abba, you got it? the fly. My father, except for being a communication engineer, is a fly hunter. He is Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, so that's
אתה
רוצה בנש, זה בנש.
That's Benesh, President Benesh.
Yeah, that's the Czechoslovakian president after the war. He met with, my grandfather got to meet with him, and he was, recognized as a veteran of the Czech military and so forth. After the war, after my, his first wife and her two children were exterminated in Auschwitz, he married my grandmother, my father's mother. Yeah.
איך אני חוזר לתמונה שלי?
מה זה שלך?
לא, שאני...
שומעים אותך, אבא.
Okay, so just an interesting story. One of my father's sisters, she was taken, they lived, as I mentioned, in the northern part of Slovakia. So when that Tiso took the control of Slovakia, so the Jews, they lived in a little village. שומעים אותי?
כן, כן.
כי אני לא רואה שום דבר.
שומעים אותך, שומעים אותך.
In a little village, and so they were taken to, some of them, my father's youngest sister, she was taken to Auschwitz. But at that time, Auschwitz was more of a working camp, not extermination camp. That was in 42. Extermination was done in Majdanek. And I happened to find in 2000.
Majdanek in Birkenau.
Sorry?
Majdanek in Birkenau.
No. Majdanek is next to Lublin. It's not Birkenau. Majdanek is next to Lublin. It happened that when I left the army in 86, I joined a company that was doing communication works some in various places. And at that time, the Polish government allowed establishment of local communication companies, because the communication infrastructure was very poor. So, and we worked with the company, and I went to Warsaw at the time. And then one of the guys told me, if you want to go to, we needed to go to Lublin to talk to some people about the company, about establishing a company, giving them some proposal. So he told me, would you like to go to Majdanek? I said, Majdanek? Yes, of course, because I had from my father that his family was perished in Majdanek. So I went with this guy, who was a very nice guy, and he talked to the people there on the spot. I told him the name of the family. So he found a document of my father's brother, Herman, or Hershey, as we call him. And we got the date of his death as December 1st, 1942.
אוקיי.
אני לא רואה את עצמי בכלל.
בסדר, שומעים אותך. בסדר.
And later on, I joined, איך אומרים, משלחת?
משלחת צבאית,
delegation of soldiers that are being sent every year or several times a year to Europe or to Poland and to see all the places of the Holocaust. So as a father of deceased, our son, Yair, that he fell in 1995. So I went with the delegation to Auschwitz and to Majdanek. And in Majdanek, I got a document showing the date of, as I said, I knew it already beforehand, but then I got it from them, December 1st, Herman Berkovich from Slovakia.
Right.
And,
Do you want to
so
talk a
that's,
little bit about your mother, as we can already see the picture here? And
אני לא רואה תמונה, איך אני רואה את זה? איך אני נכנס לזה?
אתה בטלפון שלך?
אני בטלפון, כן.
איפה ינון לא יכול לעזור לך? טוב, לא משנה, אז אני אשים את התמונה, קודם כל כרגע רואים את התמונה של סבא וסבתא מהרוסים.
אני אדבר, זום זה,
אתה יודע מה, אולי אני יכול לעשות ככה.
Tap here to chat. No. Inoni, אתה פה?
Okay. So I'll take it, I'll talk a little bit about grandmother while you're dealing with the technical issues, okay, Abba?
Okay.
Okay. So after the war, quite soon after the war, my grandfather was reunited with his two sisters who survived the Holocaust. Out of the whole family, basically he and his two sisters survived. And a year after my grandfather married my grandmother, still in Europe in 1946, and they had my grandfather here in the picture. You can see my grandfather and my aunt as well. That's already after they made Aliyah, after they immigrated to Israel. This is after my father in the middle, and my aunt is also in the middle at the bottom, my grandfather on the right and my grandmother on the left. And this is after they immigrated to Israel in 1949. After the war, they opened a shop in the Sudetenland, which was given back to Czechoslovakia back then. And then they immigrated, they made Aliyah into Israel in 1949 they came from the Czechoslovakia to Italy, and they came by a boat. And my grandmother, she wasn't, very talkative about the events of the Holocaust. Only in later years, she started speaking a little bit about what she went through. She was sent to a labor camp not far from Vienna. It's called Lobau, not far from Vienna. And in 2009, we went together to see the origins of our family. We went with her. My grandfather was already passed away at that time, but we went with her. It was a very interesting journey in Europe, and we felt like yesterday, Rabbi Goldstein talked about the fact that you think sometimes that you run the show, but God has a different plan. So we really felt it, in that journey, how God was leading us to all of these places, and we felt very, very strongly the divine inspiration and providence in that story. Just a second, I want to share something from my grandmother's side of the family. Just a moment. Okay. That's her side of the family. אבא, אתה רואה את זה?
אני רואה אותך.
Okay. So that's, we were able to really miraculously find some of these places that were, we had no chance of getting there, but we drove anyway, and we ended up finding these places unbelievably. And I'll just share another interesting story showing my grandmother with, just a second. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I want to show you a picture of my grandmother pointing to the place of her grandparents in the memorial that was erected in the village of which she was taken. Guys, can you see this picture?
It's a town. It's a town. Shagotarian.
Yeah, can you see this picture?
אני לא רואה.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we
so
can see it.
okay, you can see the picture. So
Clearly.
let me tell you this crazy story. Again, pretty much like the stories that the Rabbi Goldstein spoke about yesterday. So we were driving in Hungary to this town, Shagotarian, as my father said. We didn't know anyone there. We had no connections there, and we drove, all of us. We were about 10 people. And we were driving there, and we started asking around, where is the Jewish cemetery? Right? And my father spoke Hungarian. Oh, guys, there is a terrible background noise. I'm going to mute everybody. Just a second.
זה ראיתי.
Okay. Just a second. Okay, Abba, אפשר לשמוע אותך? Anyway, we were driving there. We got to the Jewish cemetery, but the Jewish cemetery was closed. So we were going around, looking around. All of a sudden, we see a couple. They are, walking there, and they saw that we had some interest there. So they started asking, what's what, And we said, listen, our grandmother, her grandparents were taken from this town to Auschwitz. And so we came, we knew that there is they were not buried here, but nonetheless, we wanted to see the place. And they are a local family, and they had someone bring the key, her sister or something. And my grandmother, in the picture, there was a memorial there that was erected for all of these people who were taken from that town. Now she's pointing towards the name of her grandfather, Frankfurter Natan, which was her grandfather, and his wife, Natane, that's his wife, named after the husband, Mrs. Frankfurter Nathan. And just above them was the name of the brother of the lady of whom we got the key. So that was like unbelievable story, and we felt so strongly, not just in that case, but in many other cases, the divine providence. Abba, will you take a few questions, and then we'll hear Anati talking about Ima's side?
Sure.
So two
Please,
questions.
please.
Anyone?
May I ask a question? It's David. I
Yeah,
don't have a camera
sure.
on.
Sure.
So you said that your grandmother didn't want to talk about the experiences in the concentration camp, right?
Right.
Unlike my father, my late father,
Okay.
which was talking a lot about it and telling us his experiences during the war, my mother didn't talk about it.
Oh, okay. So I've heard that when the Jews returned to Israel, nobody talked about the experiences in the camps. It was like
it's not exactly. It was more a personal issue because when the people with the similar background got together, so they were speaking about their experiences, in a large scale. Where were you, and etc. But not on a detailed personal level. And my father, he was more open on this issue.
like
Oh,
to add to
okay.
that, if I
Thank
may.
you.
I'd like to add to Naftaly's answer. I'm Anat, I'm Nathaniel's cousin. The general mood in Israel in 1948 and 47, and also before then, was one of entrepreneurship and agriculture, and we're here to revive this land and to be strong and outgoing and to take what's ours, and tried very much to put aside the diasporal views of we are from Europe, we were persecuted. It was very much a view of we are our own people. And as such, in the collective discussion, there was less collective discussion of the horrors and how we were persecuted and how we were how the Jewish people were persecuted and killed, and more emphasis on the bravery. That's also why the Holocaust Memorial Day is on the day of the beginning of the rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was more about the strength of spirit. And only when Eichmann was caught and brought to trial in Israel, and witness after witness came up and said on live broadcasted television all the horrors they went through, the general discussion switch more to additionally being also about the persecution. Clearly, people in their own homes had those who spoke a lot and wanted to get things out and kind of make sure people knew, and those who couldn't speak or didn't want to speak and go back to those times. I wasn't alive then, but from everything I've read and heard, that was the general thought process at the time.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
If I may
Nathaniel,
say,
you're silent. Nathaniel, you're mute.
this is
Just a second, I muted everybody. Abba, I'll open your microphone. In light of what Anat said, we have to understand that my grandfather went through a very different experience than my grandmother. His experience was that of heroism, and he didn't really feel the same experience of lack of control over every aspect of your life, because he was fighting the Nazis either through the partisans, through the Czech brigade. He always, felt some control over his life, which was not the case for anyone who was in the labor camps and definitely in the death camps. So he was more open because he was presenting a different kind of an experience over what he went through during the Holocaust, the years of the Holocaust. Yes, Abba, you wanted to say something?
well, it's also an issue of personality. Just a few words about the experience that my late mother, went through, is that their region was given over to Hungary because it was in the southern part of Slovakia, just north of the Hungarian border. It was given to the Hungarians, and at a certain time, I think around 42, her sister, one of her sisters, which was living in Hungary, she had a husband and her husband has been taken also to the Hungarian army work companies that were sent into Russia, and they had some shock or something, so they asked for assistance from my late grandfather, and my mother has been sent to help her sister with the business, and she had just had a daughter which lives with us. I mean, in Israel. I don't know if I sent you a picture, Neti. I don't know if you put it in.
Which one?
Anyway, של אייבי. שלחתי לך?
מתי שלחת לי?
אני אפילו, לא משנה, אני חושב ששלחתי אחר הצהריים, לפנות ערב. Anyway, so she stayed with her sister, and in 44, when the Germans started the extermination of the Hungarian Jews, so they were taken into a place where they concentrated all the people from the neighborhood in that place, and trains came in and took the people to Auschwitz. So she told us that some gentleman said, don't go on the train, don't go on the train, wait. And luckily they waited, and they went on the train that took them to the place that was mentioned before, Lobau. And there it was like a show camp. So because there were children there, and my cousin, which was a few months old or maybe about a year old, she was there, and my aunt and my mother, and they survived the Holocaust. And so she didn't go into my mother. Her experience was not as terrible as those people who went to Birkenau, Auschwitz, and things like that. So that was maybe also part of her attitude to these things.
And if we're already talking about Auschwitz, my other grandmother, most of you, certainly those of you who have been with me for several years, know already the picture of my grandmother with her two sisters, which you've seen, I would guess, more than 10, depending how many years. I always put it up on Holocaust Day and International Holocaust Day. So I brought you. You get to hear me speaking too much. So I brought my cousin. I asked her to come and speak. For my mother, as you know, is not in the greatest shape, and her sisters are a little bit reluctant to speak of these issues as well. So I asked my dearest cousin Anat to speak about this subject, about my grandmother. And Anat, I'm making you a co-host so you can share whatever you want to share. And there you go. Go ahead, Anati.
I think I'm still, no, I'm not here. Okay. So hi everyone. I don't know anybody's backgrounds, but that's okay.
I hope you know mine.
Yours I know. I saw some family members in the crowd also. I haven't prepared a beautiful presentation like we saw about Naftaly's family. And I will also begin by saying, like Naftaly said about his mother, that our grandmother was very, very reluctant to speak. I will soon get to a story that kind of explains why that was. But when she was in her 80s, Netanel's brother convinced her to go to Yad Vashem, to the Institute for the Memorial of the Holocaust in Israel, and to give a full documentation of her experiences. I remember she came, I lived in Jerusalem at the time, she came from that meeting to our house and she looked like a ghost. She was horrified. And only in her later years, when she was in her 80s, was she willing to share anything. And all the stories I tell you, she didn't share with any of the grandchildren, to the best of my knowledge, any of the horror stories. I don't know her bad experiences. I know many of the more interesting or with a twist stories, as you will hear soon. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. I used to spend time at her house many, many Shabbatot, and I never managed to get her to speak about this stuff. She wouldn't let me come on Holocaust Memorial Day. She said, Anat, I don't want to speak about it. So I will tell you what I know, but it is a very, very small fraction of what there is to tell. So Our grandmother lived in a town called Barak Is in the Carpathian Mountains. They started out being part of Czechoslovakia, and as the wars occurred and the borders shifted, they had lived in Hungary, and they went to school first in Czech and then in Hungarian and then in German. The town kept changing hands, and as a result, our grandmother, who had a knack for languages, spoke many languages. Thank you. She was the second of 7 siblings. Her father was the Torah teacher for children in the town, the Melamed. And I don't really know what her mother did. The town that they lived in is now part of the Ukraine. So it was really on the border between everything. Nathaniel, I want to share a picture. Can I take control now? So I'm going to share my screen. This is a picture of my grandmother's family taken before the war. I believe it's early 40s.
לא רואים, ענת, לא רואים. תעשי share screen. את רואה? למטה?
כן, בחרתי סקרין.
הנה, עכשיו.
Okay. And this is a picture of the family from before the war, or during the war, before they were sent away from their home. The eldest brother, David, survived Auschwitz and then lived many years in Israel. This is our grandmother, Leah. She was the second. The third brother, Joseph, was hid in the woods with the partisans, and we have a story about him later. Then came Rivka. She also survived and came to Israel and lived in Israel. And Esther, and the 2 young ones, Zev and Sarah, perished in Auschwitz, and the parents, Mordechai Tzvi and Toba Freida, also perished in Auschwitz. I don't really know to tell you much about their life in Barak Is before the war or during the war. I know my grandmother was engaged to my grandfather before the war, and this is significant as we go on. They were taken to Auschwitz in April of 1944, I believe. I know the Hebrew date, it was Kafei Be'Iyar. And an interesting story is that their transport arriving at Auschwitz was actually recorded by the Nazis, and later pictures of it were found in a book called the Auschwitz Album, which had like the Nazis' records of what arrived and who arrived, and they managed to recognize themselves in these pictures getting off the transport. Auntie Rivka was helping Sarah get off the train, the cattle car, as they were arriving in Auschwitz. Before this time, Yoske went to the woods, and when they arrived, the younger children and the parents were separated from the others. David was enslaved in Auschwitz. The 3 sisters were together, as Nathaniel mentioned. This is a very famous picture. Can you see it, Nathaniel? Is the picture visible?
Yeah, it's visible, and I guess many of my students know it. Usually in higher, they recognize it in a higher resolution, but even right, it's hard to see. Yeah. Right, it's hard to see the numbers here that are consecutive in the picture.
In the center is our grandmother and her 2 sisters. You can't see the numbers, but their numbers are consecutive. Esther, the younger one, the blonde one from the previous picture, is 7760. My grandmother was 7761, and her other sister, Rivka, was 7762. this is how they walked up to Mengele. My grandmother, who was the older of the three, held her two sisters' hands, and they went up together, and they were very, very, very close their whole lives afterwards, to the point that my grandmother, who passed away, the first of these three ladies, was, when she passed away, her sisters almost immediately took a health turn for the worse, because they were so emotionally attached after surviving all those trials together. So 2 stories about what happened in the camps, a few short stories. When they got to Auschwitz, they met a Greek woman by the name of Flora Matalon, who came from Saloniki. And they couldn't really communicate with her because they didn't speak Greek and she didn't speak Yiddish, and they didn't really manage to communicate with her. But they did know that every time she was put to work in the kitchen, she was a cook or a sous chef or I don't know what. And every time that my grandmother or any of her sisters walked by the kitchen, she used to shout at them, "Get away from here," and throw vegetables at them. And she threw cabbages or potatoes or whatever at them. And my grandmother says that those vegetables, that extra food, sustained them and helped them survive, so much so that when they got to Israel, they sought out this Flora person who also survived the war. I remember she came to my bat mitzvah. She was invited to my bat mitzvah. They treated her and her children like family, for having taken care of them during the war. I don't know anything about what happened in Auschwitz, so I'm skipping towards the end of the war to January of 45. My grandmother was very, very sick. She had typhus. She was put in some infirmary cabin or shack or whatever we want to call it, barracks. And there was a gypsy lady in the barrack with her, also sick.
Infirmary suggests that they were treated. So I don't know to what extent it was an infirmary. It was a sick cabin. You know, for people who would die on their own accord, they don't need to waste a bullet for these guys.
Yeah, and the isolation so they don't infect the rest of the workforce. Anyway, there was a gypsy lady there, and the gypsy lady said to my grandmother, "Give me your palm, I'll read to you. I'll tell you what's going to happen to you." And the gypsy lady took her palm and said to my grandmother, "Close to here, there's someone who cares very much about you. You will get out of here, you will find him, and you will have 3 children." And at this point, my grandmother pulled her hand away and said, "You're insane. You're hallucinating. None of us are getting out of here. None of this is going to happen." Well, lo and behold, my grandmother got out and found my grandfather, who was indeed very close by, and they had 3 daughters.
Right. I have Anati, if you don't mind. People, since people don't know my grandmother was so far of any, like superstition behavior or superstition beliefs. If it were not to happen to her herself, she wouldn't have believed a story like that. And she had like a bitter sense of humor when the gypsy lady came to her and said, "Oh, I'll read your future or something." So my grandmother said, "I can tell you your future as well. We're all going to die here." So, but the lady said, "Well, let me amuse you then." And that was the story. And she was very, very rational lady. So I wouldn't have, my grandmother was very far from that. And hearing such a story from her was very, was amazing. Yeah, Anati, go ahead, sorry.
It's okay. So we reached the end of the war, and our grandmother somehow made her way back to Beriksas. She said she didn't have money, obviously, to get on any trains or anything, but she knew that the agreement was that the family meets back at home. So she told me that she got on trains, and then when a conductor came to check the tickets, she'd walk to the next cabin in the train and the next one and the next one. And then she'd get off at a station, get back on the train at the beginning and start over, running away from the conductor as the train moved. And she got back home, and she was the first to get back to their house because she was sick. She was actually freed in Auschwitz, as opposed to other people who were taken on a march towards Germany. And she told us this story that she went to sleep and she had a dream that her brother Yosuke was coming wearing some uniform and that he was alive. And the next day she was standing making falafel, so a form of pasta, like handmade little pasta that you make in a strainer. And she was standing doing it by hand, and she suddenly saw him walking wearing a uniform down the lane towards where she was. And she dropped the pot. She was the most organized lady in the world. She would never have dropped anything. We used to joke as children that you could have open heart surgery on her kitchen floor 24/7. She was so neat and tidy and clean. She said she dropped it and ran out. And she met Yosuke, and it took a few days, and he asked her to tell him what she went through. And she opened up and she told him everything that happened to her. And then the next day he went to get some groceries or something. He went out and he met a friend, and the friend asked him, who came back? Who of your family survived and came back? And he told him, Leah came back, but I think she lost her mind. I don't believe any of the stories she said. They make no sense. They couldn't have happened. I think she lost her mind. And years later, my grandmother told me, when she told me the story, she said, that was part of the reason I never spoke about the war. Because if my own brother, my flesh and blood, couldn't believe that I wasn't lying, that those were the experiences we had, how would anyone else believe me? It's not possible for people to believe these stories. And so they stayed there for a while longer. A bit before the war, before they were sent away, the grandmother, Toba Friday, gave some jewelry to a Czech neighbor and said, please take care of this for me. And she told my grandmother that the jewelry, who had the jewelry. And my grandmother went and knocked on the door and said to the neighbor, please give me back my mother's jewelry. And the neighbor said, I don't know what you're talking about. We weren't given any jewelry. I was sure you died. What are you doing here? Not giving you any jewelry. And Savta went back to Uncle Yossi very, very upset, saying, I know there's jewelry. We don't have anything that survived of our mother. I want to get this jewelry. So he went in with his uniform from the woods or whatever he was wearing, knocked on their door, opened it up and said, listen closely. You've had enough soldiers around here. I know there's jewelry. If you don't cough it up in the next 24 hours, I will bring my military unit and ransack your house till we find it. And the next day, the neighbors came over with the jewelry. The jewelry was given to my mother, who was named Toba Friday after this grandmother, and I now have it. I don't know if you can see it in the picture. It's a ring and matching earrings. Okay. My mother was given these. She wore them once when my grandmother was alive, and my grandmother saw them and got so white and almost fainted that they were put in a box till my grandmother died, and I try to wear them to family events when I can. So Savta got back to Czechoslovakia, and In December of 1945, she discovered that her beau, my grandfather, was alive. And he had gotten to England. I can soon tell you the story about how he got out of Auschwitz and got to England. But they started writing to each other. And we have letters, correspondence between them. The correspondence is in my house. It is in very many languages. This is a letter my grandmother wrote in German. My grandfather wrote in Yiddish. My grandmother wrote in Hungarian and in Czech. And we have not yet found people to translate all these letters. Some of them we already have translated. The correspondence goes on till September of 1946, at which time my grandmother managed to get to London. There's an interesting story there too. There was some farmers in the north of England who were looking for a farmhand, for a boy farmhand, and decided they're going to take in a Holocaust survivor to be their farmhand to give him a home. And my grandmother went as this farmhand in the auspices of a boy. And when she got there, they wanted to send her back to Czechoslovakia. And Rabbi Dessler, who was a great rabbi at the time, interceded on her behalf and convinced them not to send her back to Czechoslovakia and to let her just leave them and go to London. And I don't know, I think he arranged for another farmhand to be brought to them, but that is really how she arrived in England. And in September of 1946, she met up with my grandfather. That is a picture from 1946 when they met each other. And in December of 1946, they got married. I'm switching sides to talk for a minute about my grandfather. My grandfather grew up in the same town in Berixas. His mother owned a store. His father, I don't remember. I knew this, but I don't remember. And he was one of 6 children. They were taken to Auschwitz more or less at the same time as my grandmother, from the same town. But he had one older sister, Lana, who got married before the war and moved to England, where her husband was from. And she lived in London during the Blitz and had a baby there, Sheila. And they agreed that anyone who gets out of Auschwitz goes to Lana's house in England after the war. Now, they got to Auschwitz. Somehow, all 5 children and the parents, no one was sent to the gas chambers from my grandfather's family. I don't understand how. I mean, there were 3 brothers who were young men and could work. I don't know how the parents didn't get sent to the gas chambers. I do know that the grandmother, Liba, who Netanel's mother is named after, she has her name, got to Auschwitz and refused to eat anything that wasn't vegetables, anything cooked, and died in the arms of her daughter Tilu on Chet Be'elul. We know the specific date she died. And actually my youngest son was born on that day. And right before she died, she told Tilu that she would live a long life and have many, many descendants. Tilu now has more than 10 fifth generation, not great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and is alive in Borough Park, New York. The 3 brothers and their father survived the war and went on the death march. At the end, were sent from Auschwitz towards Germany. And as they know that they saw the father when the march began. And at the end of the march, they lost him. Nobody knows what happened to him. But for many, many years, they were looking for their father. They took lists and lists of names of survivors, trying to see whether somehow he managed to survive the march. They only gave up looking when they realized by that point he would have been dead from old age. But we assume he probably perished on the march. At the end of the war, my grandfather, he spoke many languages. He was very talented also in languages. In fact, another interesting story, when he was a teenage yeshiva boy in yeshiva in Czechoslovakia, generally the rabbis wouldn't permit the boys to read any secular materials. That all the reading had to be from the Jewish sources. And the rabbis caught him reading an English novel with a flashlight or something under the blanket in the evening, even though he wasn't supposed to. And the rabbi said to him, David, I'm not going to punish you because that language is going to come you in good stead sometime in the future, but don't do it again. And when our Zaidi, our grandfather, at the end of the war, the British wanted to have a displaced person camp for children. And they had many children who spoke many different languages who survived the war, or teenagers who survived the war, and they didn't know how to communicate with them. And they hired Zaidi to help them and to be a kind of counselor in this camp they were creating to try and give these children activities and help them and guide them. And he made a bargain with them, and he said, I will be this counselor for this group on condition that when the last of these children finds a home and you figure out what to do with them, I get to go on a plane to England, to London. That is the payment I require, that you get me to London when these children get to where they need to be. And he was there, and they were true to their promise and got him on a plane to London. And as he was getting on the plane, the pilot looked at him and said, you're not under 18. I'm only supposed to take to England people under 18. And wanted to get him off the plane. And the people of the UNRWA, that at the time treated the Jewish displaced people, interceded and said, no, he's 18, you need to take him. And that's how he arrived in London. And as the time went on, they discovered that all 6 siblings had miraculously survived the war. This is not a very good quality picture, but you see here my grandmother and my grandfather and all the 6 couples that formed families after the war. So this is Uncle Jack, my grandfather's brother, and Auntie Suri. She's still alive in London. This is Auntie Esther and Uncle Muffle. This is Uncle Moish and Auntie Rosie. This is Aunt Lana. She was the one who was married before the war, and Uncle Wolf. And this is Auntie Tilu, the one who is alive in New York, and her husband, Uncle Shmaya, her late husband, Uncle Shmaya. I have another picture of the 6 of them. This picture is from the 50s. We have a picture here from 75, I believe, also from a family event. My grandparents are here. That pretty much summarizes the stories I can tell you. If anyone has any questions or...
Thank you very much, Anat. Thank you very much, Anat. It should be said that the overall, these individuals all had families and generations and generations, and some of them even big families. Like my parents went and had 10 kids, and other families, also. And it's an amazing thing for people who came from that background, and it's a vote of confidence in human life and in the future. And thank you very much, Anat. Thank you very much, Abba. And if let's say 2 questions, whoever wants to ask either Anat or my father. So let's see, so many hands. Susanna. Yeah.
Yes, I had a question about Frankfurters. You said they were your grandmother's grandparents. What happened
Right.
to your parents?
To what? To her parents? They were also taken to Auschwitz, and they will.
Their names were not on the stele, so.
Right, because they were not taken from that area. They were taken from a different area. That was the village where her grandparents were, and not her parents. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And Suzanne, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I didn't really want to ask a question. I wanted to tell you about some people I know that have survived the Holocaust. They didn't tell their children anything because they didn't want them to be afraid or to get sad or anything. So they kept it for themselves. But they really had this.
No. There is a background note. It's echoing. I cannot, we cannot really understand what you're saying. So, if you wanna write it or something, then we'll be able to hear it. We really couldn't hear what you were saying. So, last question, Sherry. I see your hand is up. Do you have a question?
I have a question after Sherry.
Okay. Yeah. I cannot hear Sherry. So Jerry, you'll be our last one for today.
Yeah. My question is that you called your father Abba, and I have my Jewish friends that call their father Avi. Avi.
Yeah, so this is a grammarian question, so it's right up my alley. Abba is originally the definite from based on the Aramaic convention. So it really literally means the father in Aramaic. Later on, it becomes the regular form in Aramaic as well, but that means my father in Aramaic, but this is how it is used in modern Hebrew as well. And Avi is the standard Hebrew with a first person common singular pronominal suffix, my father. Yeah, so that's the grammar here behind Avi and Abba. Abba is the Aramaic form. Actually, in English, the word Abi or Abbot come from that etymology. So the monks in the monastery, they call, the Abbey, the abbot is at the head of the monk because they're all brothers and they have the father there. So that's Abba, Avi, Abbey, and Abbot.
But is it just personal?
Also a shortage for Abraham, Avi.
Oh, it can be someone whose name is Avi, simply as a nickname for Abraham. Yeah.
No, but it's just as personal to say Abba as it is to say Avi.
No, it's nobody says Avi in Israel. Israelis say Abba. Yeah.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you very much. All right, it was nice meeting Abba.
Yeah. Bye-bye, guys. And I'll see you, as I said, tomorrow with Professor Tov, and the day after tomorrow with Dr. Yagil Henkin. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Shalom.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Shalom,
Thank
shalom.
you. Thank you.
Shalom.